fair to say the United States is going through a really difficult period, and you would expect to see it in the astrology, and in fact you do, because every planet from Jupiter outward, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and the planet beyond Pluto, Eris, all of them are challenging pretty hard. The Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn conjunction in Capricorn in 2020, directly opposing Mercury, an obviously very important planet since it's going to have some connection to the national dialogue and the fact that it rules the 10th of government and the 7th, which is where people relate to one another. And so that planet is really important and it's getting a lot of pressure. And then you have Neptune squaring the US Mars, and you have Uranus in a semi-square to that same Mars, and Uranus is due to make a station at 6 plus Taurus in early 21 in direct semi-square to Mars. So it's effectively doing that aspect as we speak. And keep in mind, when you talk about planets that have such large orbits, like 84 years for Uranus, semi-squares and sesqui-squares tend to be very important. And then Eris, in its very slow movement, is also locked into a square to the same Mercury. So the situation is pretty intense, although of course it is true that it's probably these three together in Capricorn opposing Mercury that are mostly responsible for the tremendous uptick in stress. And on the racial front, I would point to Pluto. Pluto is notorious for this. I first became aware of this Pluto factor in the 94-95 O.J. Simpson murder scandal, when Pluto at the time was transiting through the late Scorpio degrees, squaring the US moon. And subsequent to that, I've seen it show up in racial factors multiple times. And you can even say that since Pluto entered Capricorn, concurrent with the presidency of Barack Obama, race has become more and more of an issue in the US. Although I have to say overall it's probably good, because it's something that has to be confronted. And if it isn't confronted, and if it's not talked about and constantly considered, it's unlikely to change. But meanwhile, going through it doesn't feel very good. It tends to be very unpleasant at times, much like what can happen when one is going through necessary transformation on the individual level. It's great when you get to the other side, but not so good while you're going through it. And I think right now we can definitely say we're going through it. On the current horrible installment of racial strife, we see the rather incredible coincidence you always see with astrology. That's the magic of astrology, looking for the coincidental alignment of planets that always seem to show up where they're supposed to point to the event. And we notice that May 25th, when George Floyd is murdered, transiting Mars is squaring the US Uranus. And let me tell you, if you want some serious agitation, just pick on Uranus, and that's what you're going to get. And the US Uranus is, of course, a key planet in the US chart, and among a number of important things that it points to in the US psyche, tremendous independence and rebelliousness is one of them. And so you can bet there's going to be agitation if Mars is challenging like that. And then notice that a few days later, in fact, almost precisely concurrent with the violence that broke out in Minneapolis and then all through many cities in the country. That was the transiting sun going over the U.S. Uranus as well. Now, of course, we have to pray that somehow or other things cool down in the next couple of days, because if this continues into next week, then it can become pretty dangerous, because what will happen here is the full moon eclipse that is coming up at the end of next week and is in fact fully triggered by the Mars, which by then will be at 16 degrees, still catches this area pretty closely. I had said this in a prior video. So as we move into the full moon period next Thursday and Friday, let's hope and pray the situation has cooled down enough that the intensity at that time manifests on the conversation level, which of course is still almost certain to be tense and difficult, but infinitely preferable to the bullets fired on American citizens that our president seems to almost wish for.